Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this Green Alliance event on the Rachel Reeves's big speech last Wednesday, titled "Still the Green Chancellor." That's our title, not Rachel Reeves's. Just a couple of sort of housekeeping points before we begin. My name's Shaun Spiers. I'm Executive Director of Green Alliance. We've got three great panelists for this webinar. I'll introduce them each in turn. We'll be tweeting, if that's the word, about the event on our Blue Sky account. So do please comment yourself using the hashtag GA event. We'll also record the event and upload it to Green Alliance's YouTube channel later in the day. And if you want to ask a question, please use the Q&A function rather than the chat function, though you can, as it were, talk among yourselves using the chat function. So, as I say, Rachel Reeves made a big speech on the economy and on economic growth on Wednesday, much anticipated, I think much feared by many in the environmental movement, given the rhetoric that had been coming from the Prime Minister and the Chancellor in the days and weeks leading up to it. At Davos, Rachel Reeves made clear that the government's growth mission, she made explicit what I think had been implicit before, that the government's growth mission trumps all the other missions, including on clean power and net zero. When she was asked by the Times in a quick-fire question round, newts or bats, she replied, neither, I want growth. Newts and bats duly appeared in the Chancellor's speech, but the overall framing, I think, was much more positive than we had feared. She said explicitly, there is no trade-off between economic growth and net zero, quite the opposite. Net zero is the industrial opportunity of the 21st century, and Britain must lead the way. That's not the rhetoric we've been hearing in the week before. And the substance of the speech also included some positives, as well as a big commitment to aviation expansion, provided it can be done within carbon budgets, and to the Lower Thames crossing, provided it could get private finance. But there were also commitments to investment in EV charging points, to public transport, an Oxford and Cambridge rail line rather than the road line that had been previously anticipated, upgrades to the Transpennine route, electrification of the line from Wigan to Bolton, a mass transit system for West Yorkshire. And in the background to the speech, there's been some much more positive framing and real policies from other government departments. The government, MHCLG and DEFRA have worked with the environment sector to develop a new nature restoration fund to unblock house building and other development. That's been a very constructive process. Steve Reed launched a consultation on the land use framework on Friday, asked about the infamous £100 million Bat Tunnel. He said, yes, but that's HS2 for management, which I think is the right analysis of that, rather than nature protection getting in the way of investment. So it's not all quite as gloomy as it might have seemed the week before, but nevertheless, I do think the growth at any cost narrative is still quite strong coming out of the Treasury. So that's what we're going to reflect on in the coming hour. And first, to reflect on the politics and what the speech represents politically for this government, how it might play out in the Labour Party, and what it means to the government's wider environmental agenda. I'm really pleased that we've got Sam Alvis, Associate Director for Environment and Energy Security and Head of the Fair Transition Unit at IPPR think tank. Sam.
Thanks, Shaun, and thanks for the introduction. And hello to everyone watching. I really appreciate the chance to try and explain what might have been going through the Chancellor, or at least HM Treasury's head, with the speech last week. And I hope I'm going to come across a little bit more positive than a lot of the meetings I'm sure you and we were all in last week talking about the contents of the speech. So what is the sympathetic reading of why Rachel Reeves made that speech last week and put what she put in it? I think there's two potentials. The first is that this government was elected on a pledge to deliver and to show that people's lives have changed. And to do that, particularly in the fiscal constraints that they have themselves set, and because borrowing costs are high, etc., they need the private sector on board to be able to do the delivery that government doesn't feel it's able to do itself. So, therefore, the decisions you have to do alongside that are the ones that encourage the private sector, or at least make the private sector people that you are speaking to in those private meetings happy that you are on the right direction and are encouraging them to provide the investment, etc. Then alongside that, you have a very tight amount of fiscal headroom. As I said, projections for growth aren't great. Rachel Reeves makes the speech in the hope of boosting growth, right? Well, yes and no, in that we know that the Heathrow decision, for example, isn't going to translate to growth anytime soon. You're not going to get spades in the ground, if you get spades in the ground, for years. What you might get in March is a better forecast for growth, which would allow Rachel Reeves to do more spending towards the end of the Parliament. And that's in part because the OBR forecast is based to a significant amount on business confidence. If businesses feel they are more confident after this speech, because Rachel Reeves is seen to be making hard decisions, to be seen to be pushing stuff through, or seen to be doing those decisions which are, potentially received wisdom, then that could lead to a higher forecast for growth, more spending room, more ability to do things that this Labour government wants to do. So despite the fact that Heathrow won't be operational for ages, the third runway, you might still get an economic uptick from the decision itself and from the process, because after all, what is this but vibes? What does that mean for the wider environmental agenda of the government? Well, I think it's important to remember that this isn't endemic. It is still at the moment a decision. Yes, it is not a great decision for the environment on a number of fronts, and that is not just Heathrow, but it is the other airports, primarily in the southeast, that will be ready to go a lot sooner. But everything else is still in play. We still have the Clean Power 2030 target. We still have the Warm Homes ambition. We still have the rhetoric and the list of investments that Shaun pointed to in his opening. It is, at this stage, not a precedent, but is something that needs to be monitored. What we do need to do, and still the environmental movement has always struggled with this, is get better at influencing those decisions in Treasury as they are made. We tend to want to push against the way decisions are made. Like, this is not a set of decisions and processes, for example, that capture wider externalities or the inherent benefits of making environmentally friendly decisions. That hasn't necessarily worked, and it's proof again in the speech that they are still on a very formulaic cost-benefit analysis when it comes to making big infrastructure decisions. So I think we're going to have to go slightly back to the drawing board and work harder to show that environmentally beneficial decisions also stack up on Treasury's current methodology, rather than just trying to move them through. And then a final point on the politics. I don't see much internal backlash in the government or in the Parliamentary Labour Party, for example, from this decision. Yes, there will be people who are very annoyed. The West London MPs, for example, have been allowed the legroom to go out and say this is a bad decision because it's a constituency issue. But the sort of things that Rachel announced, building things, building them fast, getting opposition out of the way, is really the essence of the Labour manifesto. For MPs, cabinet members, whoever, to come out against this at this stage, and particularly against the process, like the planning related decisions that have allowed this decision as opposed to the actual decision itself, is really, really difficult. It would effectively be going against the manifesto and what they were elected on. So whilst there might be in private a couple of people kicking off in the same way that they did about the winter fuel payments or other related decisions, I can't see this being a major issue for the internal politics of the government. Thanks,
Sam. That's very interesting, and we might come back to this question about how to influence the Treasury, which is a big one. Can I just ask, though, on Rachel Reeves, on the vibes and the attempt to kickstart private sector investment? IPPR produced a report before the last election. I think it said that the UK has got the lowest level of investment in the G7 for 24 of the last 30 years, and the last time we were average in the G7 for total investment was 1990. So there is a huge historic failure to invest. Do you really think this is the way to kind of kickstart that private sector investment, or others have suggested that actually the Chancellor is just looking a little bit desperate, throwing everything at everything, and looks like she doesn't really quite know what she's trying to achieve? I mean, people have been quite damning about some of it.
So it depends what you mean by this. Is the decision to expand Heathrow and other airports in the southeast going to translate to a significant investment, particularly over the next couple of years? No. Are businesses likely to invest more because they think the Chancellor is doing things which is going to make their investments easier or swifter? much more likely. So it is the substance of things like planning decision. It is the in aggregate attitude towards the economy and towards the quote unquote hard decisions, pushing those through against the opposition, whoever that opposition may be. In this case, it's us, unfortunately. That is the sort of stuff that can raise business confidence, and particularly raise the confidence of the sort of businesses that get a lot of airtime in Treasury, whether it's the city, whether it's the private finance organisations. Like, it is less the impact of Heathrow itself than the aggregate vibes effectively, and what they do to the individual investment decisions of organisations and the risk benefit calculation that they're going through.
Great, thanks, Sam. Well, let's move on now to Areeba Hamid, who's the Executive Director of Greenpeace, formerly led the Global Finance Programme for Sunrise. Areeba, I expect you to be breathlessly optimistic about the Chancellor's speech, but I wonder what you think it means for relations with the environment movement and for the government's general environmental orientation, and also this fascinating point that Sam's just raised about kind of needing opposition, and we unfortunately appear to be the opposition.
Yes, thanks, Shaun, and hi everyone. Good to be here having this really, really pertinent conversation this afternoon. So I do think that there were things in the speech that were positive. It's worth just starting with that, because for the first time ever, we still have a chancellor who is talking about net zero as the biggest opportunity for growth in the 21st century. There was lots more to like. It has been mentioned, whether it's trains or the climate nature restoration fund. Those things are positive. But I also think it's slightly unfair to judge her on just one speech. So I went back a little bit and looked at some of the checkered history of the announcement. And it's interesting that the picture that emerges is more and more confusing. I was trying to answer this question pretty definitively. Is she still the greenest chancellor? And I think that it has been one step forward, two steps back from the journey. In January 2023, freshly back from Davos, it was much simpler time then. We didn't know it then, but it was. She came back and she said she wanted to be the greenest chancellor ever. She said, and I quote, "We cannot persist with walking into a crisis unprepared and at the last minute producing hugely expensive fixes to get us through while the underlying problems, those weakened foundation, remained untouched." Wise words. And then the 28 billion pledge was made. I'm sorry to say this. We've all been burnt by that. I'm sorry to bring it up, the one we must not talk about again, but we have to bring it into the picture. By June 2023, as we all know, the 28 billion green investment every year that was promised was dropped from the manifesto altogether. In her first budget, the freeze duty, the fuel duty was frozen again, and the bus fare cap was risen to £3, prompted criticism from the Green movement, rightly so. She has then announced, obviously, investment in green housing. As Sam also pointed out, the warm homes pledge remains, and as the clean power pledge. In her Mansion House speech, she talked about a package of reforms designed to position the UK as a global leader in sustainable finance, including a consultation on the UK green taxonomy. Lots of us who have been working on the green taxonomy issues have been watching it from the EU perspective as well. That was November 2024. And then things start to get really curious, where she talks about growth trumping everything else in Davos in January, comes back, supports the expansion of major rail projects in the north, but mysteriously calls out Batson News as if they were holding back the economy, and supports expansion of Heathrow and other ports, citing that they will generate jobs. I think that there is a little bit of short-sightedness here, whether it is the need for finding an opposition and coming out there and saying, I'm standing up to them. These decisions and these announcements actually point out to a little bit of short-sightedness and a little bit of lack of clarity. As somebody who's the leader, I think industries, even fossil fuel industries and oil and gas industries and airport industries, need signals that are clear. This is just confusing. I actually don't know whether people who work in these industries, in particular the unions who are representing these people, are convinced by any of these arguments. And to Sam's point about internal strife within the government, I do think that Sadiq Khan came out within minutes saying that he will oppose the expansion of Heathrow. And I think that that is already spelling trouble. Within businesses, I know that Ryanair and British Airways have their vested interests, but they also came out saying Heathrow expansion is not the right thing to do. So it begs the question, who is she doing it for? If she's not doing it for these businesses, if she's making both the voters confused, the local voters. There was a report in the Times in the weekend saying the ground campaign is ready to start campaigning against Heathrow expansion. Then who is she doing it for? And that comes back to your question about is she finding an enemy, and are we that enemy? I do want to say that there are some litmus tests that also remain, particularly about the new oil and gas licenses in the North Sea. The Scottish courts recently quashed 2 licenses for Rosebank and Jackdaw just last week in the midst of all these announcements. And it remains to be seen when they go back, when Ithaca and Shell go back to the government asking for their permissions to be renewed, what is the answer going to be? They are illegal as they stand, and the ball is within the government's court. I do think that Ed Miliband has been conspicuous by his absence in all of these announcements, and I think the silence is not going to hold for very long. And lastly, what is our job as the movement? I think we are used to dancing this delicate dance for quite a while now. We have to continue to support the government, to create the conditions, to engage with communities, to try and be as positive as we can when we see positive announcement, but also not let these promises backslide. Labour was also elected on a huge climate promise. One of my favorite statistics to quote from the election is that 28 MPs who ran on an anti-net zero platform, all of them lost their seats. We've done the math, we've seen that. And in this country, that kind of rhetoric just doesn't cut it. So I think we have a job to remind them that that was the mandate they were elected on. We have a job to remind them that there is a global leadership vacuum right now with the leadership change, especially in America. And the UK has pledged to be that leader, and that leadership begins at home. And we have the job to hold them to account when they keep backsliding. So that's what we'll be watching out for.
Great, thanks, Areeba. I just pick up one question that's in the Q&A, just to remind people, put questions please in the Q&A, and if you can make them short, that'll make it easier for me to read them. But somebody is asking about the kind of the nature of the influence in Davos, talking to people like BlackRock who've got investments in Gatwick. Are you worried about who Rachel Reeves is getting her advice from? I'm thinking particularly with your former Sunrise hat on.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because obviously our colleagues from our peers from NEF published an interesting report that said that she's getting her advice on Heathrow expansion from Heathrow. So I think it's worth saying that the governments will always, court the city. BlackRock and others will always be a part of the negotiation. However, I think the numbers are quite clear. If she is pursuing a growth agenda, it's quite clear that stranded assets is also something that this very community has started to talk about. If you build an oil and gas field in a declining basin like the North Sea, or if you try to build a third runway where actually there's loads and loads of opposition to it, including legal challenges, is it really growth? And how much are you going to spend on it before it actually starts, especially the oil and gas fields, before they start becoming untenable? So I would think that BlackRock and others are also talking to her about stranded assets and that argument, which actually carries risk and insurance risks, and she's taking those into account.
Great, thanks, Areeba. So the last speaker, Rachel Solomon-Williams, Executive Director of the Aldersgate Group, but previously working in government on energy and environment policy. And Rachel, it'd be really interesting to have your perception of what progressive businesses now need from government to pursue the climate and nature agenda.
Thank you, Shaun. For those who aren't familiar with us, the Aldersgate Group is a membership organisation, and we have about 65 members, including large businesses, as well as NGOs and academic institutions. The business members we have are forward-leaning, so they are members of the Aldersgate Group to make the case for taking action on climate and the environment. I think I violently agree with everything that the others have said. The first thing to say is, what do businesses need at the moment? It's a really difficult time to do business in the UK right now. The cost of everything has gone up. The relationship with the EU has not settled down, and some of those trade issues are still making it very hard to engage, particularly for businesses who are present in more jurisdictions than just in the UK. The arrival of Donald Trump has introduced even more uncertainty. We don't know what it means for tariffs. We don't know what it means for trade. And in terms of investment as well into different technologies, even if there might be an opportunity there. So what businesses need is an absolutely rock solid set of messaging and also action to help address some of those fundamental factors that will help them to be successful and to help them contribute to net zero and nature protection. What the Chancellor, I think, was trying to do in some respects was provide that sort of certainty that the government is behind the net zero agenda. And as the others have said, there was some really good kind of words about the importance of that, and indeed some specific announcements supporting different sectors which will encourage decarbonisation. What it didn't really do was provide any of that certainty or progress on underlying issues. So all of our members want to understand how energy costs are going to be addressed, and that's particularly true of electricity, where it's going to be so fundamental to decarbonising the economy, and planning as well. So it's very helpful that the government understands that planning needs to be improved. Coming after the bats and the newts was completely counterproductive, and I think there's a bit of a concern that if that's the approach they're taking to the natural environment, it might mean that the consensus around net zero is a bit more fragile than they're saying. And you know, we welcome the Nature Restoration Fund, but if that's going to be delivered, we need the resources to deliver it. So we need the regulators involved to be properly funded to do their job, rather than sort of undermined as though they are in fact in the way. So where are businesses on this whole kind of thing? Please just be completely consistent. And the optics around Heathrow are quite difficult, as you know, never mind the green agenda, but it makes it look as though the government isn't all in one place on this issue. And that begins to undermine investor confidence immediately. There may be some investors who are specifically interested in airport expansion, and of course they will be delighted about this announcement. But I think in terms of the wider business environment, I'm not sure I've heard many voices coming out saying this was a really helpful thing, because it sort of doesn't show any strategy. So what businesses would like to see is government has an overarching vision. It's going to put in place some really fundamental factors which will help it make it easier to do business in this country. Coming out with kind of odds and ends of announcements which don't seem to help with those underlying problems isn't going to move that conversation on. So I think we're really interested to see them now focus on specifics. What are we actually going to do that's going to change things? What does growth actually look like? And how does the industrial strategy really wrap into all of that? I'm not sure that aviation was featured in the industrial strategy green paper that the government published recently. So if that was the case, why not focus on some of those sectors if we're looking for new announcements? And I think the last thing I'd say is, we do want to keep taking people with us on net zero. And that, again, that means, and that's the wider public, because that will affect individual decisions that are made about what people do in their individual lives, but also responses to planning applications and that kind of thing. And again, consistency from the government is absolutely everything.
Great, thanks, Rachel. Really interesting that you talk about consistent messaging. I was at a meeting with some quite senior business leaders, many involved in infrastructure and construction, and they were a bit despairing about the mixed messaging about the elevating of one growth, the growth mission over the other missions. A lot of the businesses have taken a lot of effort to build in a way that's going to be nature positive, and they now see, is the government interested in this? Are you picking up similar concerns?
Absolutely. I mean, the way that I see it, and that I think many of our members see it, is it's absolutely fine to have an overarching growth mission, but if you're going to do that, then everything else has to flow from it and be consistent with it. So underneath it, you might want the industrial strategy, the circular economy strategy, the environmental improvement plan, not mentioned frequently enough. And all of these things should be integrated with those goals rather than beginning to be placed in opposition with each other. And I think there are lots of people in government running around trying to do really fantastic things, but it feels though there's that lack of common thinking at the top, and all these things are happening next to each other rather than as one integrated plan. So we absolutely need to see much more integrated thinking.
Thanks, Rachel. Well, let's have a panel discussion, and I'll try and pick off some of the questions. So do please upvote your favourite question. But I just want to come back and perhaps start with Sam on this, to this question about the apparent perception that the Chancellor needs an opponent to show business that she's going to ride down all opposition, and that opponent has to be us. And I wonder why it's thought that a positive narrative saying that the country has got to, everybody is going to benefit from growth. Growth can be good for the climate and nature. We all need to get behind this. It's going to benefit cost, standard of living. It's going to be spread across the country. Why do politicians not think that a positive narrative is going to succeed, and they must pick a fight, particularly pick a fight with actually a constituency that probably should be behind the government's broad agenda on many things?
So I'm going to get a bit meta here, and it's not about the environmental movement, it's about how you do politics, right? So this government has clearly set out who they want to be for. Like they've said, we're here for everyday working people to make sure their lives are tangibly better by the time that we leave government. And it's very clear that that is the case. The difficulty they have had is in articulating, therefore, who you make decisions against to privilege that group and to make sure that, like, to firmly demonstrate on your side. Like, politics is and always will be a fight. You can't always do everything for everyone. You need a framework to allow you to make decisions which are say, okay, in this scenario, there are trade-offs, and we are going to go down on the side that privileges working people as opposed to group X, group Y, group Z. That is a very successful formula that we've seen, unfortunately, populists take on board across the world, but it is also a lesson for mainstream politicians as well, that they need to really define their voting coalition and why they are making a certain set of decisions. Now, that doesn't mean, therefore, you have to be against environmentalists. You could very easily say the vast majority of working people are pro-environment in this country. The decisions to boost the environment will also improve people's everyday lives, whether that's access to green space, whether that's easier, cheaper, cleaner ways of getting around, reduced health impacts, like all of these things. But politically, you still want to make an argument that these are against some people. So Trump, as one example, would say this is against big business, this is against whoever. We may want to take similar lessons here. They are constrained by, we want to be pro-BlackRock, we want to be pro the city, so that can't be you're against. So what the environmental movement can help with is better articulating who they should be against in defining the fight for working people. And that's the interesting question, I think, rather than saying, at the moment, they've just landed on the environmentalists and that's it for the rest of the campaign.
All right, I put that back to you, Sam. Who should they be against?
I find it difficult to see a route through the next election where some form of economic populism isn't inherent to an electoral victory for progressives. So that means potentially defining yourself, as Biden did often, against some corporate interests or against profit over purpose, like these sorts of definitions. But as I said in my opening segment, to be fair to the government, no one has given them a better way of delivering their current objectives than through the private sector, which they need to maintain on board. So whilst their bit of economic populism could go down quite well, particularly with the reform-curious voters that they want to keep in the tent or potentially win over, it's not quite so simple of that, because it might make it actively harder to therefore demonstrate to those people that you've done the things that they want to happen. It's not an easy one.
So, Areeba, I'm going to ask you. Obviously, there are a whole lot of people who care about climate and nature who voted Labour at the last election, who won't like the a government turning against climate nature groups and policy, the obvious places for them to go are the Green Party and the Lib Dems. You and Greenpeace did the climate vote campaign in the election, but the Greens and Lib Dems, or the Lib Dems in particular, have been quite quiet on this, haven't they? Is that your perception?
Yes, they've been quite quiet, and I think I mean, we're second guessing what their strategy might be at this point, but I think that assuming that those votes will go to either of them is also perhaps an error. I agree with Sam that there is, in the short run, from now till the next election, policies that make difference to people's bills. I mean, some of the conversations that were most effective at the doorstep when we ran Project Climate Vote, which was a canvassing project that we did from speaking to voters door to door, A, to encourage them to vote, and B, to keep climate in mind when they go to vote, were around energy bills. And at the beginning, people don't necessarily see a connection between energy bills and net zero. But when you start to talk to them about the reliance on a global gas market where basically private companies make most of the money, and ending that reliance will bring down their bills, that there is a positive sort of inference of that. And I am curious as to why there is not much more talk of that. And then I think, again, this is the difference between what the Treasury has been saying and versus what DESNZ has been saying. I think that's the narrative that Ed Miliband has been talking about since the beginning. But it feels like that is not really reflected when we think about net zero can make people's lives better, and therefore Treasury is going to do this about it. And that's a question that we have come up again and again within the Green movement. How do we get the Treasury actually to put this front and center? Because as long as DESNZ keeps saying it and the Treasury doesn't, that drift will remain. And I think that is the challenge for me, is more than other parties, is actually asking Treasury more and more to talk about both short-term policies, not just long-term, where, you know, things might not change in a decade, but what are the things that are going to happen before the next election so that people are feeling that difference in their day-to-day lives? I'm not sure if I answered your question. But yeah, my feeling is that there is a positive narrative. I totally agree. I think instead of actually pushing back on oh, this is green versus growth, there is much more positive narrative building that we can do. And maybe that's where the Greens and the Lib Dems come in, because there is a common ground where all of them are asking for, you know, local wealth to be created, local public transport to be expanded, access to green spaces, sewage being a big issue that both Lib Dems actually ran the election on. How do we end that? And I think there are those spaces that we could go in which could build that positive narrative instead of saying it's us versus them.
Great, thanks. And on the Treasury, Sam said earlier that the environment movement needs to get better at influencing how the Treasury decisions are made. So I might ask you all later how to do that. But Rachel, from your members' point of view, you've made clear you want policy consistency, but are there other ways to growth that are of particular interest? I think particularly on the 5th anniversary of Brexit, whether your members might be more concerned about trading relations with the EU than big infrastructure projects, or are there other things that they're looking for?
It's a whole range of different factors at the moment. So the trading relationship with the EU and things like the emissions trading system and the CBAM, so they're going to be absolutely vital. Our members, I think, generally favour alignment of the UK ETS and CBAM with the EU equivalents, but there are some concerns about the way in which the EU ones are being implemented. So that then means that we've got more uncertainty about how these different really important policies are going to be aligned. There remains a whole lot of red tape and other associated friction, which means trading into the EU is really difficult still. So yes, addressing some of those factors first would be very helpful. Doesn't make for a very exciting announcement, very difficult to do politically. And so I think this is the problem, where actually a lot of the activities that are needed from government are quite boring, might take ages, probably take some wrangling between different government departments, maybe cost a bit of money, and don't make for a very interesting announcement. And so and they get pushed down into kind of junior bits of individual departments to go away and sort out, and are not escalated. I saw a question in the Q&A about kind of leadership at number 10, and we really do need that kind of grip, which says, here is the vision for where we're trying to get to. Let's be very clear about what the factors are that are impeding that. And I do think they do have an idea of it. So in the Industrial Strategy Green Paper I mentioned earlier, there was a list of what they call horizontals. So here are factors that are, if we address these horizontal factors, it would make it easier to develop industry in this country. Great. And they were all really accurate. So let's get on and try and address those first. Some of the infrastructure projects, energy infrastructure is completely crucial to all businesses in this country, and particularly heavy industry. So that, I think, would be seen as a top priority in terms of supporting business development and decarbonisation. Everyone talks about grid all the time, but it's absolutely true that we can't electrify our homes or our transport system or our heavy industry or anything unless we have the grid to support it. So that's a form of infrastructure that is absolutely needed. Other forms are also important. So you can't run a business if you can't get your goods from A to B effectively and cheaply. There are all sorts as well. But yes, I think those kind of hygiene factors are really difficult at the moment and very important.
Thanks. Wonder if anybody's got any, Sam, maybe this is for you. Rachel talked about clear messaging. New Labour was obsessed with narratives and with message discipline around the narratives. Is this government good enough at narratives? And if it did carve out a clear narrative on what it's trying to achieve, would we be happier than we are about a kind of speech saying we're going to expand Heathrow? Is the broad narrative still a positive one?
I'm assuming that question is for me because you think I'm a modern day Blairite, as not actually being of age when the Blair came to government. But let's be honest, narrative is a problem. And that's because they are, to be fair to them, they are being pulled in a lot of different directions between really trying to fix things urgently now and the sense that they need to do some long-term things that result in change in the future. And at the moment, growth-ish is the thing that holds those things together. But they have struggled to, and I think actually the benefits of the speech on last week were that they started to do this, was to have that slightly more positive narrative. And they're in a situation really where they're like, we want to do anything to do growth, as opposed to here is, we think, the best route to growth, or as we would recommend at IPPR, here is the kind of growth you want. It's not just growth, it is a particular direction of growth that is shared, that is green, that is distributed across the country and across different income segments. They don't feel able to do that at the moment, so it would be great to see them get there, but it's not easy. There are some really foundational problems that they are trying to work through, and I think if we say it is the worst thing that we can do, I think, is just turn around and say, here is your easy narrative. It's just pro-environment, and that's great, rather than recognises that actually being in government is incredibly, incredibly hard, and retrofitting a narrative that holds together everything that they are trying to do is not one that you can just conjure up, I'm afraid.
I'm sure that's right. I have been surprised by the lack of attention to the question of what sort of growth and for whom are we trying to get growth. That's been surprising. And Areeba, Rachel, I don't know if one of you wants to comment on this, but the government is absolutely, the government says we are going to get growth, and actually the UK, in a very turbulent world with a potential tariff war going on and lots of economic disturbance, it's beyond the ability of any government to guarantee growth. However, I don't want to be a counsel of despair. You can obviously try to do better or worse, but getting growth isn't going to be easy in the next few years, is it?
No, shall I go first? It's an incredibly kind of complex, wicked problem, isn't it, as you've said? And maybe they could be more open about the fact that external factors are going to make that difficult. But I suppose they want to show that they're gripping the situation, and they don't want to pass off responsibility, because they said in their manifesto and in their whole election pitch that this is where they would take responsibility and really push this agenda. So I think it's very difficult for them to say, the wider context is going to influence very significantly what the outcome is. And we see it in a very micro way, don't we, where suddenly the numbers on inflation look a little bit better and everybody in the Treasury breathes out. But that's, as you say, a factor of a lot of different things all happening at once, most of which we don't have any control over. So I suppose the question is, can they identify which factors they do actually have control over? That would be the trick to pull off. Make very clear what these wider circumstances are, and then say, okay, we've got 3 levers we can pull. This is the way in which this will improve, and what we could dig down. What does growth even mean? For whom and where? And is it green growth or not? But some more clarity around that would be really helpful.
Yeah, this question of comms and how they're deciding on their messages. I mean, I'm no expert, but it feels like in the beginning it felt still quite cautious and sometimes even like a party not in power. I used to say that it sort of reeks of defeat and fear. I think that they have changed that consciously by talking about growth, but also, to my mind, a regular person, do they even care about whether it's growth or not? I mean, I understand this narrative is about businesses and investment, but then it's not backed by massive investment. I mean, the UK is, like you said right at the beginning, one of the least sort of underinvested. The productivity growths are some of the lowest in the world. So productivity rates. So, and that is because the public investment is low. And I know there are lots of constraints. We spent a lot of time in the beginning of this government talking about fiscal rules, and all we got at the end of it was just readjustment of how debt was calculated, instead of actually a slightly braver decision to invest a bit more by borrowing if it meant borrowing. And I know that comes with complications, but I think that is what is needed. And that's for business, and that instills confidence. But the question of growth and for whom and where is a pertinent one. And I'd rather, again, have a more positive message about how it's going to make a difference in people's actual lives before they go to polls again, rather than having a 2040 vision where spades are going to be in the ground or the flights are going to go off or not. I mean, it really sparks more controversy than actually a positive response. So some more work needed.
Thanks, Areeba. I'll come to the most upvoted questions in a moment. But Sam, when you were at Green Alliance, you edited a brilliant pamphlet, a collection of essays on the Inflation Reduction Act and how that sort of growth was going to make a real difference to people's lives in the way Areeba's spoken about, and the involvement of the unions in that, and so on. And I guess the subtext of the pamphlet was the UK needs something like the Inflation Reduction Act. But of course, it didn't do that brilliantly for Joe Biden or for Kamala Harris. What are your reflections now on that sort of policy?
They're pretty robust, and he might say that anyway. But I think 3 things of the Inflation Reduction Act is: one, it was a terrible name, and ultimately it got beaten by inflation. So you look at the things that it purported to do: increase in manufacturing investment, increase in manufacturing jobs, like turning the US economy around. On nearly every micro and macroeconomic indicator, the US was going gangbusters thanks to the Inflation Reduction Act and its sister acts, the CHIPS Act and the Infrastructure and Jobs Act. The issue was inflation continued to be the absolute most salient thing for people's everyday lives. And actually, if you look at the passage through Senate of the Inflation Reduction Act, the sort of things that pair really nicely with industrial strategy on wages, on medical costs, on childcare costs were traded out of the bill by Joe Manchin. So you could have had a much more rounded political response which paired industrial strategy with those everyday economic outcomes. And that remains absolutely essential and will be the number one learning I take to this government. It's fantastic. It's great that you're doing an industrial strategy and everything with it. But unless you pair that with something that people are going to see and feel, then you're going to be marking your industrial strategy, this grand economic intervention, by outcomes that it is not purported to improve. And that will be real difficulty. And I see the same in energy. It's fantastic that government wants to lower bills. So let's work out how to lower bills rather than heap that wish on GB Energy, which might have a marginal impact on bills, particularly over the next couple of years. Like, you need things to be marked by the things that they're promising to do. Otherwise, you'll be on the hook for them.
Great, thanks, Sam. I don't know if anybody else has got any reflections on the IRA. If not, we'll move on to the most uploaded questions. But in a way, I kind of think the one that's got the most attention, we've sort of answered, which is on Heathrow. How is expanding Heathrow going to promote growth and prosperity for the population of the UK rather than just jobs for the boys? Rachel, you were in government for years. Why does government keep coming back and saying that Heathrow is a kind of golden bullet?
A business case. I mean, there will be a business case sitting in the Department for Transport, which has a business case rating attached to it for anyone who follows these things. And a range of factors will have been taken into account in determining the business case rating. I've never seen the business case for Heathrow, so I've no idea what's in it. But it will be sufficient to enable politicians to say, there is a business case here. I know that one of the massive factors in the business case is actually transfers. So it's not to do with people coming to the UK or indeed leaving the UK, but actually changing planes in between other destinations, which attracts tax and other direct economic benefits, which the Treasury would definitely point to. I imagine they would also point to jobs associated with doing the actual construction and all of those things. So local jobs there. This isn't my point of view, by the way. It's just what they will have factored in. And so obviously Heathrow themselves will benefit from it. I know that they're not owned by a UK overall owner, so that's an interesting point of view as well. And then, as somebody pointed out earlier, the investor community will have said this will yield returns in terms of investment, and therefore it's a good thing. So you can argue, I think, that doing this change will attract investment of sorts and will deliver income of sorts to a community and to the country in some respects. You could also have a conversation about what else you might have chosen to invest in as a higher priority.
Thanks, Rachel. That was from Kate Wilshaw, that question. Anon has asked whether number 10 is listening too much to the tech bros rather than the grassroots environment groups. But Areeba, in a way, if they are listening more to other people than us, that's kind of our problem more than theirs. I just wonder what you think we as a sector can do to get our voices heard.
Is this the question which mentioned the octopus energy person as the tech bro? Yeah. I mean, I think there are tech bros and then there are tech bros. I think he has been, Greg Jackson has been actually flying the flag for renewable energy upgrades, location pricing that will bring down people's bills day in, day out, all over media. And I think if they are taking advice from him, then I hope they're listening. And to somebody else's question, actually, which was also in the chat, was if they want to ally themselves with private interests and want to show that they're and want to pick an enemy, then I do think that the oil and gas companies could be that enemy, because they are not going to abide by these rules. I mean, the Shell CEO has already said that he's going to challenge Jack Doyle's decision at the highest court because he's sunk some money into it. This is counterproductive to the strategy that this government said that they will deliver on. So I think I think the government should talk to everyone. And they should listen to everybody. But there are people who are actually providing the solutions. Octopus Energy has been one of them. And then I would love to hear what Shell and BP are saying to the government right now. And the government does talk to the Green Movement. I do think that there is much more engagement with the Green Movement, especially since that became less and less in the previous government, especially in the last few months of the previous government. It felt like they didn't listen to the civil society at all. So there is engagement with the Green Movement, but I think the question is, are they engaging with us so that they can keep us sort of, feeling complacent and not criticize them, or are they actually listening to some of the things that we're bringing to the table? That remains to be seen, which is why I think we shouldn't be afraid of flexing our muscle every now and then.
Thanks, Areeba. Sam, on Areeba's challenge there, is the oil and gas industry a plausible enemy? We're looking for take the heat off bats and nukes?
I mean, one of the times that Labour was doing really well in the polls in the run-up to the election was when it was just saying windfall tax over and over and over again, because it told a very clear story of, we are on behalf of people who are paying too high energy bills. We've located a revenue source that we think of the people that we think are responsible for this problem, and we are rectifying that. And I think to sort of mediate through the last question, government's job is not to listen to any one group, it's to mediate between interest groups and come to an answer which is like most suitable for people across the country, right? And for a voting coalition in particular. Like, they will need to listen to tech bros in the same way they will need to listen to the environment people. We just need to make sure our answers reflect what they're trying to achieve, and the windfall tax is a fantastic example of that. Like, government is always going to have to talk to the oil and gas industry because they have decommissioning to get them to do, they have workers they're employed, they've been structurally important, we still have to use a bit of gas. Like, you don't want to see these people shut out, you just need to make sure that they're mediating to come to the correct outcome that they're looking to achieve.
Yes, thank you. And on Areeba's point, I mean, it's clearly the case that the environment sector has got much more access now, much more sympathetic government, and in different departments there are. I mean, we're not going to like everything, but there is at least a sense of a serious dialogue on things like the Nature Restoration Fund, which is certainly sorely missed. I'm just going through the questions here and trying to find one. Which I've now lost, but I think it's about kind of whether the government can do better in translating kind of big and abstract policies to people's everyday lives, and particularly on the really vexed question of energy bills and home heating and insulation of housing, support for people in the private rental sector and so on. Is the government doing enough there? Because if energy bills carry on rising, it'll be very easy for people to say, oh, that's all because of net zero, and we've seen some of that already. And who wants to respond? So, Rachel.
On this. So the government has or is developing a warm homes plan. They've been sort of releasing bits and pieces of the warm homes plan as they go along, rather than publishing it all in one go. But I think we will see a full plan during this year. They've also said, I'm not sure if they've said it publicly, but I believe there's going to be a much bigger campaign, sort of public information campaign. It might be subject to spending review provision, to make sure that people understand about net zero and about the kind of opportunities associated with that. I do really think that they have got the memo that this is the one area where it's very easy to promote benefits, where it applies to people in lower income groups particularly. There are so many obvious win-wins to this. And I mean, talking to people in the heat pump industry, it feels as though those who kind of part of the industry as well are really feeling a shift in terms of how installers are approaching the situation. So much more kind of positivity around heat pump technology compared with gas boilers now. So even the industry themselves are seeing that shift. And we have got a fantastic ministerial advocate in the form of Miatta Fanbuller, who I think also personally very much understands the issues. So what we haven't yet got is that high-level clear messaging coming out. I think of all the issues that I've been watching lately, this is the one where we're most likely to get some of that clarity during this year.
Can I just come in, Shaun, on bills? Because like, the bills question is absolutely fundamental, and regardless if they've moved away from the absolute figure or not, like, Labour is on the hook for reducing people's bills by the end of the Parliament. Like, the public know it. My alma mater, Public First, has done some very interesting polling on like the state of recollection, and of all the people who remember the most what the bills promises is Labour to reform potential switchers. Like, it's an absolutely crucial political issue. Now, the Warm Homes Plan will be a part of that, undoubtedly. There is only so many people the Warm Homes Plan is going to be able to reach. And you will be able to tell a story that if we did more of this, we can reach more people. But you can't get to the end of the Parliament maintaining a licence for the rollout of renewables unless you have found a way to bring down bills for nearly everyone, frankly, and particularly for the lower middle classes, which are vital to voting. So I think rather than sort of look at every decision we need for net zero and go, how does this decision reduce bills? We need to slightly divorce the two and sit down and look at the makeup of an energy bill and say, what are the constituent parts of that, and where can government bring them down alongside the private sector or on their own? And then use that license to say, okay, well, actually building a load more renewables, increasing the pot of the CFD, even if you extend contracts, whatever, like, that's still going to put bills up, and that's okay, because we've done that on the other side. There is one potential get out. So energy security is obviously massive. It buys you a lot of license to do a lot of these decisions. Now, energy security is a counterfactual. Your bills would have gone up by £300 if we hadn't done anything. That's great pre-justification. It's quite hard to square afterwards because you don't feel any different. But there has been some interesting polling that, for example, if Martin Lewis comes out and said your bills would have been £300 more, then that is almost like you've got that £300 benefit because it's a trusted third party, not the government, telling you what the counterfactual is. So exploring ways to message that energy security and make it feel more real, I think can help when actually reducing bills by a tangible numerical amount is going to be very hard.
Great, thank you. I'm going to ask you all an unfair question right at the end now, because we've got three minutes, which is that you have managed to trap Rachel Reeves in a lift, and you're very upset with her speech and how some of the things she's been saying. And I'd like you to just say succinctly how you persuade her that she's going on a wrong path. And while you think about that, because I didn't give anybody notice of that, just to say that to remind everybody that we will be uploading this the video of this to YouTube later. I'm sorry I haven't gone through all the Q&A. There's been a lot of it, but we will send that to all the panelists so they can reflect on it, and all the bits in the chat as well. So thanks everybody for attending. And now, who wants to get Rachel Reeves first? Areeba smiled.
Well, I do recommend watching Brian and Maggie, the interview that this journalist did with Margaret Thatcher, and without actually putting her on a pedestal. I think one of the things that she was really strong about was a single-minded focus and sticking with that messaging. And like I said right at the start of this conversation, for me, pick a lane and stick to it. That is what the industry needs. That's what the unions need. That's what the voters need. That's what the Green movement needs. Do things that actually add up to that messaging, whether they are short-term or long-term, and stop getting sort of, one step forward, two steps back. Stop. It's confusing. It's confusing policymaking, and we need a North Star goal and then steps towards it. So pick a lane and stick to it.
Thanks, Areeba. Who next?
Go on, Rachel.
I would have said exactly the same thing. And as a detail, please don't pit net zero and nature against each other, because that is the opposite of picking a lane and sticking to it.
Sam.
Tricky. So I will say you can build an onshore wind farm in about 3 years. Heathrow is going to be operational in 2035. If the thing you care about is investment in the economy by the time you leave government, stick with the net zero stuff.
Great. Thank you all for those quick answers. Thanks very much to the panelists. Really interesting debate. Thanks everybody who's attended, and see you at the next Green Alliance event. Thank you, everyone.